Morning, people. Welcome from the sunny lands of England. My name's Omar, and you're listening to what is usually our revision streams. And today we're going to tackle a topic which I will admit I'm a little bit unsure on. I am trying my best in wrapping my head around it, but it's going to be a little bit more simple today. I've had to go old school and pick up the books to read to you for this week. We're going to be covering mainly cultural studies through the lens of feminism and gender studies, but this does rely on an understanding of philosophy. So we're going to be going over those two, I guess, broader strokes. And essentially, what we're going to do is look at standpoint theory. Now, standpoint theory, as I detailed on Twitter leading up to this event, was that standpoint theory claims that each person is seated in a different rank among the social hierarchy. And because of this, each person views the social climate from a different vantage point, which only provides a small look at the social whole. But the theory also claims that those who are lower on the social ladder tend to have a greater understanding of the social whole rather than those higher up. As such, we're going to have some questions as to what exactly is a standpoint. We're going to go through those quickly. We're going to ask ourselves, what is intersubjectivity, which is the name of the stream. We're also going to be looking at epistemology, which is what this entire theory relies on. So we're going to take a quick reading from a general practitioner's book. We're actually going to look at Friedrich Hegel, or George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Mainly because this is one of those theories that, because it has developed so much in such a short amount of time, and the standpoints, ironically, in which we look at where this theory develops are so detached from their original people. We're actually going to move away from my usual idea that we have to listen to and look at the original theorists. So sorry about that. We're going to move away from our usual MO this week. We're also, if I check my notes real quick, we're going to look at the criticisms as well, and then wrap it up. Now, I will say, just to begin, that this stream was inspired by Jack Saint, also known as Lacking Saint, or now is Jack Saint in progress. It's a little bit annoyed about, if I'm honest. I have had to move away from him a little bit over the weekend because of his garbage tweets about Carnival. But nonetheless, the theory, well, the revision of this theory today is very much based on his stream where he talks about his, I guess, I don't want to use the word awakening, but his realization. A lot of the things he believes weren't really looked at critically until recently. He talked about his low socioeconomic status and his upbringing, and how that allowed him to look at things reflectively. It is a very useful. It was a useful stream, not only for its, I guess, emotional value and how it impacted people and himself and how he viewed the world and why, but it's a great stream just because, well, Jack Saint makes great content, if I'm honest. I really like his Fallout 4 video, which you should probably check out. I'll give his best video, which is the least looked at. So let's actually just get started now, finally. So what exactly is a standpoint? Well, there are 6 things that make up a standpoint. If you go on Wikipedia and you check what standpoint theory is, it says these 6 things, which I find somewhat irrefutable, if I'm honest. I'm going to put a reading from Matskim Kokoshin, I think you say his name like that, about standpoint theory, just for your own reading. Oh no, again, it's too many characters. It's from 2014, so I'll get rid of the 2014 bit. I'm still 7 characters over. But essentially, it's from a journal. It's a journal article from 2014, titled "Standpoint Theory is Dead. Long Live Standpoint Theory. Why standpoint thinking should be embraced by scholars who don't identify as feminists." It's a great piece of reading. It's honestly, a lot of the stream's information is reliant on Koshushikin's, I don't know how to say the name, I'm really sorry, based on their reading, based on their understanding of standpoint theory. And so what we understand a standpoint to be is a place from which human beings view the world. In this respect, it is all about, to an extent, it comes with massive asterisks, human experiences, and therefore in it being reliant on human beings viewing the world, we are going to separate human experiences from that of nature or a naturalist perspective. Also that of, I guess, if you believe in a cosmological or an idea of like a greater or higher power, it's going to be removed from that. So we're going to focus on our own experiences as human beings because that's what we know we can understand to our best of our abilities. 2 of 6, a standpoint influences how people adopting it socially construct the world. It argues that through human experiences we then develop ways of thinking which then go on to influence how we form a society. I think that's pretty straightforward. 3rd of 6, a standpoint is a mental position from which things are viewed. That is to say, our experiences are filtered through our experiences, which sounds a bit silly, but I don't really understand what a bird is going through when it talks about flight. However, as a human being, I can understand what flight is through the perspective of if I go gliding, or if I'm a passenger in a plane, or if I fly a plane, if I am so relieved, if that makes sense, or I'm so blessed and lucky. So in that respect, we have to remember that those experiences in which, if we're flying the plane, being on the plane, or was I flying a kite? What did I say? Or basically being not a bird. My experiences are filtered through my experiences. So going to the check-in desk is going to be a relationship to the world which is going to differ based on who I am and what my worldviews are, and who I am and how I'm perceived in that world, and also how I then internalize those experiences. So if I have a positive experience of going through security check-in at an airport, I will create a mental position saying airports are a safe place and it's perfectly fine for me to go through. But if something terrible happens while I'm at the airport, I may conclude through my mental filtration of my lived experiences that airports probably aren't the best thing for me or other people to use. Therefore, 4 of 6, a standpoint is a position from which objects or principles are viewed and according to which they are compared and judged. This is a little bit more difficult and intangible to explain, because basically a standpoint is being argued that it is we look at, say, two things. For example, when we see I have a cup in one hand and a plate in the other, we say from our perspective of not being the cup or the plate, we can call that plate a plate, well, that's the plate, sorry, and the cup a cup. 5 of 6, the inequalities of different social groups create differences in their standpoints. Because this relies on hierarchies, those who are at the higher points of the hierarchy will have a different social standpoint from those who are below them. And we can kind of see this in a historical standpoint, right, where we look at the peasantry and their lives were, they had to cut up straw and then make sure it was dry and then put it on their muddy grounds to make sure they could sleep properly and not catch a terrible disease, and then they wouldn't be able to eat lemons, so they had rickets, whilst a king could have the bountiful beauties that the world and the surplus around them would provide that they could then eat from without issue. And so what we're going to look at here in standpoint theory is this idea that they aren't living the same lives, and therefore they have different experiences and perspectives of the world. If, for example, whilst they might both share the idea that the king is somehow, a gift from God to rule the lands, a king's experience or perspective of his peoples will be that of subjugation, whilst the peasants who is being subjugated might have a potential disdain for the king or an envy as to how they might live, or they might view the use of taxes being spent on the king's new crown or a party as being somewhat lavish and unnecessary, and therefore they might have a more critical perspective of the king, the institution which allows a king and a kingdom to exist, and or how they play a role in that in upholding the king in this hierarchy. And 6 of 6, so lastly, all standpoints are partial. Now, impartial is this idea of being or being not biased. So partial or partiality means a level of bias is there. So for example, standpoint feminism, which is kind of the main pioneer of this theory, the one that kind of really stands by pioneer theory or standpoint, really pioneers standpoint theory, is argued to coexist, so it exists alongside other standpoint theories, so it's not alone, which is actually why I gave you the reading in the chat there to argue why standpoint theory might be good for you even if you're not a feminist. However, take a quick swig here. We're going to take a quick reading anyway, because I'm going to throw that last bit out in the bin. We're going to read from 50 Key Concepts in Gender Studies. if we're going to look at standpoint theory by those who advocate it the most, let's actually look at what feminists and gender theorists actually say about standpoint theory, as to why they stand by it and why they think it's so important. So it's only 3 pages. Hopefully I'll go through this in about 5 minutes. If you don't like reading, you're probably on the wrong stream and I'm doing the wrong subject, but hey. So anyway, here we go. Oh yeah, let me put another botched APA reference for you to use. So Jane Pilcher and Imelda Weldon are the people who wrote this book. So again, if I read this accurately and you like what they said and you want to use it in your own essays, or you're revising it for a exam, there we go. So in everyday life, this is on page 163 as well. In everyday life, the notion of a standpoint expresses the idea that our view of something, say of a painting, is influenced by where we stand in... Oh, covered the mic there, my bad. Okay, yeah. Before I pulled out the mic cord there. No, we're all good, we're all good. We go again, we move. So yeah, let me just start again. In everyday life, the notion of a standpoint expresses the idea that our view of something, say a painting, is influenced by where we stand in relation to it, for example, close or at a distance. In simple terms, standpoint theorists in gender studies similarly propose that understanding of the world is related to, and in this case, gendered social position. This basic idea of the importance of social position or location has been developed by standpoint theorists into complex arguments about the production, status, and purpose of research-generated knowledge, and has formed an important critique of, quote, traditional, end quote, scientific epistemologies. Epistemology, we're going to go into a bit later, is about the theory of knowledge. So, a standpoint then is an identification of a, quote, morally and scientifically preferable grounding for the interpretation and explanation of nature and social life. And that comes from Donna Harding in 1986. And also alongside Dorothy Smith in 1988, Nancy Hardstock is widely cited as the key author of standpoint theory. And yes, if we were going to talk about, as you can see in a description, if we were going to talk about any theorist in relation to standpoint theory, it would be Nancy Hardstock. But we don't, because of 2 reasons. One, that's what I said, 2 reasons, but one else. For 2 reasons. One, whilst her analysis on standpoint feminism is valid and a fantastic way in understanding standpoint theory more broadly, I'm willing to argue that it is more of a 102. It's not the first thing you have to learn about in standpoint theory, which is why I've included epistemology today, because if we don't understand how theories of knowledge are developed, how on earth are we going to understand what Nancy is even talking about? But anyway, we move on really quickly. Now, Hardstock has developed her arguments in several publications over a number of years. Her initial formulation was published in 1983 as, quote, the feminist standpoint, developing the ground for a specifically feminist historical materialism, end quote. Now, historical materialism is definitely related to Marxian critique of social hierarchies and theories. So, again, it's also, if you don't really understand Marxian critiques, jumping into Haraway, no, it's not Haraway. Hardstock is going to throw you off a little bit. But anyway, so for Hardstock, feminists have paid insufficient attention to the epistemological consequences of their claim that women's lives are structurally different to men's lives. In addressing this issue, Hardstock draws on Marx's argument, like I said earlier, that understanding and knowledge are structured by location in material or economic life, and Lukács' development of the standpoint of the proletariat. Essentially, what's been argued here that when I talk about peasants and kings here, and they might have differing perspectives on the world and how that world is formed, essentially it is a development and a reliance on that, a growth of that critique. But again, we're going to come back to some even older ideas, older than Marx. Yeah, well, a social idea older than Marx, heresy, my goodness. So for Hardstock, the following features of standpoint are particularly important, and I kind of go over them again as to what makes a standpoint in 6 ideas. But for Hardstock, she argued that material life structures Understanding of knowledge, that's the epistemological idea. So how you create knowledge is important to understanding this. 2, those groups occupying different positions in the structure of material life will therefore have differing worldviews. As I explained earlier, the king having a different worldview of his kingdom than the peasant who lives within it. This is then doubled down in 3. The power of the dominant group means that their perspective is hegemonic. We understand hegemony to mean, I guess, the dominant, to simplify or to oversimplify, dominant or controlling group. You can have a minority group which is hegemonic, and therefore this is somewhat similar this is somewhat an extension of that argument, right? It's arguing that that if we have a hegemonic perspective, it is one that people end up agreeing with. And again, we can go back into last week's idea of manufactured consent here, that in it being hegemonic, we are not necessarily following a worldview which serves our best interests. That's essentially what is being argued here. 4, as a consequence, the vision of the oppressed, air quotes, must be struggled for. A key to this process of struggle are systematic analyses and educational via political activity, and from this, social change and liberation may result. Essentially, what's being argued in this last point is that we shouldn't really advocate for the hegemonic powers that be. Instead, we should, and I'm going to turn myself up here because it seems I'm going to complain I'm a bit too quiet. Instead here, is that better? Cool, glad you like it. Oh, no, is that too loud now? We don't know. You know what, I'll just keep going, and if someone complains about the sound again, I'll just change it. Like, cool, everyone agree with that? So yeah, basically, if we don't advocate for the hegemonic powers, we can instead argue for a bettering of conditions that works for our own best interest rather than the interest of someone else who's trying to exploit us, is essentially the argument here. And again, in the case of feminist standpoint theory, what is being argued here is that the hegemonic structure or system of power is being dominated by men, and therefore women should advocate for the betterment of their own conditions rather than arguing for the betterment of men or the men's social position, and therefore let's not cry so hard for men, is essentially long and short of it. If women's lives are better, we should, by extension, or the logical extension is we should have a more fair and equitable society. So that's the argument here. I'm going to jump a few paragraphs here. So, as it says here, this is a structural position that potentially makes available to women a, quote, a privileged advantage point, end quote, from which to understand, quote, patriarchal institutions and ideologies as perverse inversions of more human social relations, end quote. Which is basically what I've said there again. If patriarchal or man-controlled social hierarchy is working at the detriment of women, women shouldn't really be working with men to, I guess, ruin their own lives. Which, you know what, I don't really have a complaint about that, if I'm being honest. So, yes, in labelling her standpoint of theory feminist, Hartstock not only identifies the feminist perspective on women's shared experiences as her, quote, preferable grounds, end quote, for interpretations of social life, but also emphasizes the liberatorial potential in the achieved character of knowledge gained through standpoint. Essentially, what is being said here is that in taking a stand that it stands for something, it shouldn't be misconstrued to then mean something else. Essentially, what is being argued here is that in women having a non-hegemonic position, Hartstock is then arguing that any time we talk about standpoint theory, we're going to be looking at the less powerful social factor in the hierarchical equation, as it were. If we can identify at least two social systems existing in a similar or in the same society, and we identify one is more hegemonic or more dominant than the other, any standpoint we then go on to talk about should be should emphasize the less socially dominant or socially subjugated perspective. So basically, when we talk about standpoint, let's think of it like putting someone in a soapbox, but the soapbox is for the peoples, not for someone who has a plinth. Okay, gonna jump forward again. There are, I mean, look, don't get me wrong though. There are some serious critiques of standpoint feminism that we're gonna get on to a little bit later. Here we go. We've gone. Where's my jump? So yeah, for example, in feminist standpoint theories, contrary to conventional scientific methodology, the social identity of the researcher is regarded as important, and attention is given to power relations in the research process. If we're gonna, because this does lead into eventually, long story short, an idea of identity politics, as it were. In this case, this is the kind of identity politics people talk about when they want to disparage, or when they essentially strawman the argument about how people argue for identity politics. In this regard, looking at the gender identity of the researcher is important, because what is implied here is that they will implicitly hold a worldview which may not be to the benefit of women. This does have some problematic interpretations and later on justifications, but these can be seen in before I actually make that nice transition, let's just finish this paragraph actually, because it's quite important. Furthermore, standpoint theories posit a relation between research and politics. Like I said, I remember at the beginning, talked about a liberation can come through political activism. So again, if someone isn't politically active in this idea of standpoint theory, essentially the argument that the research is probably going to be garbage. Now, feminist standpoint theories, for example, can be characterized as advocating research on or about women, which generates knowledge in opposition to dominant, which is in this case patriarchal, constructions of women's positions and experiences, and it's also research for women. If we want to talk about the idea of male gaze, in this case, in a less people say Kuma brain, the idea of like someone is like detrimentally horny. This is more being applied to the idea that research is being designed for women to read. That's not to say it's like dumbed down or anything, but it is done in a way so that women are able to engage with the material in a way that is not necessarily inherently critical. Because when we take on inherently critical positions, they can be somewhat problematic, right? If we're always going to argue that, if we're always going to preemptively argue against a position before, when it's the moment it's presented to us, we're never really going to hear all the ideas that are contained within. And as such, standpoint theory to a certain extent is written, jumped the gun a little bit there. Feminist research to a certain extent is written for women to be able to engage with, so that they can engage with academic principles in the way that they aren't preemptively going to react negatively to, which I think is an interesting development on how we talk about feminist academia, at least. Now, versions of standpoint theory have been applied to a range of empirical studies across many disciplines. Hirschman in 1997, for example, is cited here that we should review, and also Maynard and Purvis from 1994. Now, standpoint theory, though, has arguably had its highest profile in debates about feminist research methodology and epistemology. In this case, research is what we're looking for. Methodology is how it gets done, and epistemology is how we understand it to be true, or how we get to know it. Now, the writings of standpoint theorists have been criticized, defended, and reformulated, with the reformulations themselves attracting critical attention. And that will be near the end for further reading. The key criticisms stem from an initial tendency of feminist standpoint theorists, like Hartstock, to ground their approach in the shared experiences of women, apparently undifferentiated by class, ethnicity, or sexuality. This tendency has attracted such charges of essentialism or biological determinism, the idea that your biology is going to dictate how you look at things. Determinism is largely, whether that's technological, biological, social, class. Determinism is usually reacted to negatively. Why? Because, well, people like to think that they have some control over their lives, and even if people don't have control over their lives, people aren't a monolith. Any social group isn't, one size fits all. There is nuance, there is fractures, there's points of contention within these groups. And as such, arguing that women all have this shared experience of the world is highly problematic, especially when you devoid it of class, when we're talking about hierarchies in this case. If we can identify that someone has a better quality of life than someone else in the same society, class is definitely going to be a factor that we have to be considered there. Ethnicity, again, notice we didn't use the word race here. Ethnicity would matter in this respect, because depending on your ethnicity, you may have completely different predilections. Is predilections the right word? To certain health conditions. And in a social context, why does that matter? Well, if you have a health condition that affects how and the way you live, you're going to have a different experience of a social interaction, say something like a hospital or the work environment, which will again impact your class situation. And again, sexuality, the experiences of, I guess, straight women is going to be different to that of gay women, and even today, is Pan Visibility Day, as it were. So even pan women are going to have a different experience than that of bisexual, lesbian, or their straight counterparts. So in this respect, we've identified women as one larger group that can be divided into at least 3 smaller groups that Hartstock kind of just ignores in her original writings of standpoint theory. So, for example, one of our detractors here, Fraser and Nicholson, argue that Hartstock's discussion of women's reproductive capacities mean that she at least partly bases her grounding of standpoint theory in biology. The concept of apparently undifferentiated women of early standpoint theory has also led to accusations by postmodernists, key words here, that the theory is universalist. Now, postmodernists would be very upset about this and accuse Hartstock of being universalist as a bad thing, because essentially postmodernism is the rejection of universal truths, or the idea that there is a blanket rule for everyone. And so, yeah, no wonder postmodernists are upset. And that's where we kind of begin to dabble in a little bit of the bio here and the idea of intersubjectivity here. And why I argue that standpoint theory is a rejection of postmodernist values. And even though it might sound like it's rejecting universal truths and norms and ideas that everyone kind of agrees with, it's not quite postmodernist. And even postmodernists would say it's not postmodernist. So anyway. Now, this is actually a point that Hartstock kind of agrees with. So in 1998, she actually conceded that her early focus on women was simplified in that it omitted other important social relations, and she now sees rights of her, quote, multiple standpoints. That is to argue that people exist in not just one point in a social framework. They don't just argue or see the world or experience the world through one perspective, that people are way more dynamic and complex than that, and things like, and I'm going to argue on Hartway's point here, but that things like religion will have you see the world slightly differently, your moral framework will have you see the world slightly differently, your ideological predilections as to what you see as good or bad, not morally, but in terms of practicality, will also influence how you see the world differently. And that's just ignoring the more obvious things such as class, ethnicity, and sexuality. Now, other feminists such as Hill Collins from 1990 have found value in standpoint theory in the development of black feminist standpoints or lesbian standpoints. However, the reconstruction of a singular standpoint into multiple standpoints does not satisfy all the critics of the approach. For Heckman in 1997, they recognized, or say the recognition of multiple standpoints is at odds with the standpointist claim of privileged vantage points on social reality. And this is where we get to a breakdown of what standpoint theory is, and here we really begin to lay into the idea of intersubjectivity. And so, to quick conclusion from the end of this chapter, the debate on standpoint theory has clearly reflected broader concerns in gender studies, especially the issue of how research and theories around gender relations in a way that integrate difference while simultaneously give recognition to enduring inequality, especially between men and women. As Hartstock herself concluded, whatever its shortcomings, standpoint theory has successfully produced a fertile terrain of feminist debates about power, politics, and epistemology. Now, we've used that word epistemology quite a lot, and we're going to get into it really quickly, but for further reading, you might want to read Signs, A Journal of Women in Culture and Society. That is the 22nd volume from 1997, number 2. There's also a special issue of Women in Politics, volume 18 from 97, number 3. And Maynard in 1994 discusses standpoint theory in their overview of debates on feminism and research. Razmong-Lagu from 1989 also considers how a 1960 studies of shift working women that is women who worked in industry and worked in shifts. So, they might work, 9 to 5, and then someone else might work like 5 till 2, for example. Their shift working women might have been an improvement if they had taken a feminist standpoint approach. In this respect, this might have been for their working rights. Because again, the 1960s is also how where women kind of come back out of the housewife stage after the war, to kind of get back into the workforce. So we've talked about essentialism quite a lot, and so let's quickly check the idea here. Let's check the notes here to make sure I'm on track here. So epistemology is a bit of a sticky one, right? Because what exactly is it? So I'm reading here from 50 Ideas You Need to Know Philosophy by Ben Dupree. And essentially what we're going to be looking at is this idea of how knowledge is acquired and how it is formed into not only theories, but I guess entire worldviews of understanding, right? And so we're going to look at Immanuel Kant a little bit, because Immanuel Kant is a big dude in the world of philosophy when it comes to logic and reason, right? And in understanding logic and reason, we begin to understand how reason is how knowledge is somewhat, I guess, given to us would be more true. Let's double check, make sure I'm actually getting the right notes. I haven't accidentally got the wrong page here. Double checking the contents here. The problem of knowledge. Yeah, I got it right, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, sick. Alright, cool. I have to double check the contents here. So reason experience. So, page 20. I really like this book. I just get knowledge of it. I won't get knowledge of it. I was just reading the tripatriate theory of knowledge. Got a bit distracted. But I'm reading this and I'm just like, oh yeah. I just get distracted by what it says. So, basically, the problem with knowledge is that when we understand how people begin to reason and how people develop experiences, is that fundamentally they are subjective. Yet we use subjectivity as this throwaway idea that we shouldn't trust, that anyone who is subjective in any way, shape or form is not to be trusted. And so we look at reason as this thing that's supposed to guide us, supposed to push us in the way that we're supposed to go. Now, the issue between rationalist and therefore empiricist, empirical usually is, empirical is usually used to argue this idea of facts, right? Idea of knowledge is that we have to question how empirical evidence is gathered, right? If we are going to argue that we have observed a measurement over a certain distance, we first have to ask, why did that unit of measurement exist? How did we come to argue that unit of measurement is useful? And how can we then, to double check that measurement is accurate, how do we know that we have observed that measurement correctly? Now, that's for scientists to argue, if I'm being brutally honest. They have to go off and argue why all that stuff is relevant and how it matters. But for, I guess, the social sciences, this becomes very interesting, because when we begin to argue about facts and figures, we have to question how someone came to those facts and those figures in the way that they did. Because if they don't have these necessary facts and figures to hand in a way that is useful, they will create, potentially anyway, a worldview which is inaccurate and or damning to particular peoples that weren't included or thought of in their understanding or in their gathering of the evidence, right? And so when we question how facts become facts, we end up creating a massive dilemma for ourselves to answer and understand a little bit better. Okay? And if I'm going too fast, let me know, people, because I'm kind of zooming through this. I thought it would be a little bit further on in the debate or in the revision, but we are not. So I'm going to read here. So, quote, how do we come to know things? Is it primarily through our use of reason that we acquire knowledge? Or does experience gained through our senses play a most significant role in the way we get to know the world? Much of the history of Western philosophy has been coloured by this basic opposition between reason and experience as a foundational principle of knowledge. Specifically, it is the main bone of contention between two extremely influential philosophical strands, rationalism and empiricism. Now, there are three key distinctions that we have to keep in mind here. And to understand what is at issue between rationalist and empiricist theories of knowledge, we have to look at the three key distinctions that are used by philosophers to elucidate the differences between, and that is the idea to look at. Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot to give you. Oh, thanks for reminding me. The reading for this, so you can go and gawk at the book yourself if you want to grab it. And so we've got priori versus posteriori. I hate this word anyway. So something knowable is a priori if it can be known without reference to experience. So that is to say, without any empirical investigation of how things actually stand in the world. They use the example of 2 + 2 is 4. There's no experience as to what I know 2 to be. I don't have to experience the number 2 or the number 4 to know that if I put two 2's together, I get the 4, right? So I don't need to have to go out into the world to establish it as a truth. By contrast, if such investigation is needed, something is only knowable a posteriori. So, for example, coal being black is used as a posteriori. So that's the idea that like I can see with my eyes that coal is black. I can touch the coal and feel its rough surface staining my hands to know that it's black, right? And so if we want to verify this lump of coal to be actually black, I actually have to look at it, right? I can't just look at it. I have to know I'm looking at it to know that it's black. I also have to know what black is fundamentally. Have a descriptive word for the color that the lump of coal is, to accurately describe what is going on there. And so we then move on to things like analyst versus synthesis, right? And that is this proposition that analytic doesn't really give us any more information that is already contained. So when people talk about like having an analysis or an analytical reading of a media text, for example, in our case, or of a social construct or of a social event, they are only looking at what is contained within that event or that reading or that media text, right? I can't attribute meanings that don't exist within the reading to it because that's not analysis then, is it? Analysis can only be a deconstruction of what is going on there. And therefore, as I make sure I haven't lost what I'm reading here, and therefore, yes, so the truth is therefore can only be apparent merely by a virtue of understanding both meaning and a relation of the words used. And this then we're going to move into something like semiotics, where if we understand what symbols, and signs are and what they mean, we can then go on to understand what is being meant by the words being used and what is meant by them. So, for example, they use the example of the idea of all spinsters are unmarried. If we know what a spinster is, and we know what being married is, and we know what being unmarried is, then we can kind of understand the argued truth that is being made in that statement, right? If we don't know what those things are, then how can we argue? If we don't know what marriage is, or someone being married is, if we don't know what being unmarried is, if we don't know what spinster is, how can we argue that these things are true or false if we don't understand them to be true in the first place? If we can't break down the statement if we can't analyze the statement and see the things within it to then say this is true, this is true, this is true, and therefore the conclusion must be true, we're kind of at a loss there. Okay? And now you might be asking, why does that example matter, right? Well, fundamentally, what we're talking about is a social interaction here. A spinster. Actually, what is it? How would I define spinster accurately? Let's find out spinster. So a spinster is a term referring to an unmarried woman. Oh, here we go. Going back in circles here. Who is older than what is perceived as the prime age range during which women usually marry. It could also indicate that a woman is considered unlikely to ever marry, and as such, the term originally denoted a woman whose occupation was to spin. In this case, it was usually yarn. So, what we have here is a social interaction, which is marriage. We then also have a socially given parameter, which is the ideal range of marriage. And then we also have a condition, which is then given to women. So if a woman has to be in a certain age range to marry and they've now surpassed it, we have argued that a true, social experience here is one which is entirely dependent on, our understandings of these social interactions, fundamentally. So we're going to keep going in circles. So I'm going to move on pretty quickly. By contrast, synthetic meanings are ones in which we attribute to the thing we're analyzing, right? So, sorry, not the thing we're analyzing. Analysis is within, and synthesis is something outside. So, in this case, they use the idea that all spinsters are miserable is synthetic. It brings together different concepts and so provides significant information, or in this case, misinformation, to establish whether it is true or not. We'd have to inquire, in this case, the mental state of every unmarried woman, and this is where it gets quite messy. Where we've gone from a sentence or a statement which can contain all of the information within it. Spinsters are unmarried. To move on to compare it with a statement which is outside, where information is attributed to the statement. In this case, so and so being miserable. So we have to not only do we have to understand what misery is. When we use ideas like all or absolutist terms, we then apply to it statements, things, beings, objects, ideas in which we have to understand beyond the statement itself, right? Because in our analytical statement, the idea that all spinsters are unmarried, which is again another absolutist term, we understand here within this self-containment. Even if we don't know all of the words, which I argued a little bit earlier, if we don't know what a spinster is, we have to look it up. We can understand that they are unmarried. I don't know. I think I'm going around in circles here. I don't think I'm making myself very clear. And this is kind of the dilemma of understanding epistemological arguments, in that things seem contradictory, and you might even present an argument which is contradictory. But because we're asking how we even know that thing to be true or untrue in the first place, we immediately have a conversation as to how or why that is relevant. And I'll be honest with you, I think I might be getting myself a little bit lost here. This is one of those things that you kind of script out and then you read off the script, because you can quickly find yourself in a loophole. So Thomas de Quincey from 1830, used the idea that mathematics has no foot to stand upon which is not purely metaphysical. This is where we go back originally, so metaphysical being the things that are beyond, tangible, as it were, to this idea that when we looked at like a priori argument, that is, we don't have to experience these things personally. It then becomes metaphysical. So if we aren't experiencing them ourselves, this knowledge is somehow almost detached and irrelevant from our personal experiences. And that's how it gets really messy. So we then go back to intersubjectivity here from our seemingly weird detachment and tangent from understanding how knowledge is acquired, to then go on to question or reapply it to the idea of a standpoint. So if we are questioning how knowledge is acquired, and we are using statements to argue in purely internal social systems and hierarchies, we are going to have to look at an idea that truth is being used from an experiential perspective, right? That we have to understand what the things are in order to then go and argue if the thing that they then go on to espouse is true or false, right? So trying to make that an easy clarification, because this is ridiculously unnecessarily complicated. If I know what a king is supposed to do, if I know what a king is intending to do, and if I know what a king wants to do, am I saying those experiences as a king myself, or am I saying those things as someone who isn't a king but who I have expectations of, or an imagination of what a king might be, right? My goodness, if I feel out of my depth, I feel like I'm definitely getting into that end of the pool where the water's up to my neck, and it shouldn't be that high. I don't know why. Maybe I'm underprepared. Probably isn't something you should admit to a live stream that's going on YouTube. But hey, so it's how we end up then moving into the idea of intersubjectivity, if we're being honest, because if my expectation of someone who isn't a king of a king is different to what a king or a fellow king has of themselves or a fellow king, then we have a subjective viewpoint, and that's where we go into the ideas of what I just talked about, or I tried to talk about earlier, in terms of being rational or like experiences versus like true facts in and of themselves, right? So intersubjectivity then is an idea that talks about a variety of human interactions here, right? So it's a coined term by social scientists as a shorthand description for a variety of human interactions. And so, for example, social psychologists ideate or put down onto paper as ideas that there are at least 7 definitions of intersubjectivity, right? And if you go outside of social psychology, in this case they have other definitions. So, but social psychology matters for us because we're looking at a social construct or a social construction, more accurately, right? And that's the idea that our society is built up of many different little things that then make it a bigger picture, right? So number 1 of 7, we argue that people's agreement on the shared definition of an object. Now, this is important. Why? Because it takes us all the way back to the beginning, where we said if we can compare 2 things and say this is a plate, and this is a cup, I think that's even the same size I had them at the beginning. You and I both agree as to what a plate is. We both have an imagination. My idea is like it's kind of a flat, circular object. There's probably like a little rim around it or whatever. It's usually a white plate. I always imagine white plates. And like a mug might be like short and stumpy with a tiny little handle. We both agree that, we both agree on the definitions of what makes a plate, whether that is what goes into the plate, what it might look like, what it can do. And we both agree on what makes a mug, what it goes into it, what it can do, for example. So that's 1 of 7. The second part of intersubjectivity, the second bit that defines at least social psychology of intersubjectivity, is that people's mutual being shared awareness of an agreement or disagreement, or of an understanding or misunderstanding of each other. Excuse me. So the idea of like, let's agree to disagree is an idea of intersubjectivity, right? Excuse me again. You don't think I'd be so burpy from all this drinking water, but hey, it's probably all the air going into my body from all this talking. But hey. So yeah, if we are aware of an agreement or disagreement in this respect, we can share an understanding of a conversation, the flow of a conversation. And so why does that matter? Well, because 3, people's attribution of intentionality or feelings and or a belief to one another. So we might agree or disagree on an argument or a perspective because we might feel differently about what a plate or a cup might be or do. We might share the ideas of what a plate might be and can do, but we might disagree as to how we use a plate, right? So some people might use plates to opa the restaurant, right? Smash it on the ground. It's a celebration. To others, that might be a faux pas. Like, you don't smash the china. That's the good plates, right? That's the good china. Don't do that. And so those feelings might be influenced by our beliefs. So if I believe, smashing a plate is a good way to make noise and celebrate, I might intentionally smash the plate. Whereas someone who might think that it's a faux pas to smash up the plates might have might feel negatively to it because they believe it's not a good thing, and therefore they might not ever intentionally smash a plate, right? Even if they do it accidentally, it's a bad thing, and so they might not be able to separate the bad thing of smashing the plate to the good thing that is intentionally smashing it for a celebration. So that might be a reason why there's a misunderstanding and they agree to disagree on the subject, right? It's also that's a really bad argument if that was happening in real life. But anyway, 4 of 7. People's implicit or automatic behavioral orientations towards other people would also define intersubjectivity. In this respect, if someone is subconsciously behaving towards someone, that's going to impact both of their experiences of a conversation or experience. That would then allow for a form of analysis, so internalized, soul searching of that person and their feelings. Will be aware of intersubjectivity to be relevant. The almost obvious one for this would be racism, right? Someone has a negative perspective of someone else because of a reason. In this case, it'd be their skin color, right? Or their perceived skin color. They then have 2 completely different worldviews. So one person doesn't like the person because of the color of their skin. The other person in that conversation has no issue with the other person because even if they are visually different to them. We then have 5 people's interactive performance within a situation. These are a good way to kind of look at this as the idea of like, what would those shows where they go, what would you do? And it's someone who has they're stealing from a blind person, or someone's fallen down and needs help getting up, or an old lady trying to cross the road, and it's like, what would you do? And some people just like keep to themselves, they're not going to bother with that nonsense. Other people might be like, I'll help you, old lady. Don't steal from that blind person. I don't know what my third example was, or my second example of the 3 was, but hey, they have a different a reaction to a situation. 6 of 7. Another way to define intersubjectivity is people shared and taken for granted background assumptions, whether consensual or contested. These would be again a bit like almost attributing a belief system to someone without actually knowing if they do believe it, would be one way of looking at this. It's not the best way, but it's a way. And then for 7, the final 7 of 7, the final way to define intersubjectivity in a social psychology way is to talk about the variety of possible relations between people's perspectives. Now this one is key. Why? Well, I'll tell you after this quick water break sip. So if we have people and each person is multifaceted, right? They have a belief system. Let's go back to that. So number 3, for example, if someone has a different motive that will influence their intentionality, if people have different feelings and therefore they feel about a situation differently and to each other differently, and if they have different beliefs about one another and to each other, that is then gonna, all of those, differing points of, data going into them is gonna influence what goes out. Intersubjectivity is going to be a way in which we begin to understand that as an individual without applying those differing internal monologues, as it were, towards a broad spectrum of people, right? Because if we can identify that someone can be happy about a plate being smashed, someone being upset about a plate being smashed, and even if they come from the same cultural background or they have the same generalized beliefs, for example, let's say religion and political standing, but they believe differently on how plates should be treated. What we can see here is that we can't take the findings that we have for one person and apply it to absolutely everyone, right? And that's where we find standpoint theory getting into a little bit of trouble, because what it did is say that the experiences of all women are shared, right? And this is where it gets quite messy. So essentially, what we're looking at here is an idea that when we compare it to epistemology, which is about the being concerned with knowledge, what we're looking at is an idea that people are multifaceted. They have relationships to each other and social situations, as well as social hierarchies, and everything that makes a person is worthy of study. But also how these people then go on to influence the world is also worthy of study also. So, did I miss? Oh, I've missed some notes. Have I missed some notes on epistemology? Nope. Philosophical nature of knowledge. Yeah, potential sources of knowledge, belief and reason. Talked about that. Structure of body of knowledge is justified belief. Whether all justified beliefs may be derived from justified foundations or whether they are coherent. And skepticism. Okay, we talked about that kind of. I might come back to them though. So, so quickly double down as I embarrassingly checked my notes audibly at that. When we then go into subjectivity and we relate it back to standpoint, what we have to understand is that, and this is where we go back to the idea of Hegel, what we're looking at is a social construction of people and events and things and buildings and institutions that rely on, I guess, an agreement in order to work. Now, standpoint theory challenges this fundamentally. If we are aware that standpoint theory is arguing that hegemonic powers make decisions to the detriment of other people, then an analysis of those underserved people is going to also, I guess, tilt towards a disagreement within that social construction, institutions and peoples that has previously been unlooked at. And when we argue and understand that standpoint theory is built on the idea that, you know, perspectives of marginalized people or even oppressed peoples can help to be used to create more objective understandings of our society or a more complete understanding of our society, then we begin to understand that standpoint theory doesn't just give a voice to marginalized people for the sake of doing so, but it does so with the intention of making our understanding of the world more complete. Does that make sense? And this is quite important because Hegel looked at the idea of like a master-slave dynamic, right? And in this, we have at least two, to very quickly simplify, two very clear and differing positions. We have history being written by, I guess, slave owners that we understand. The reason we argue it is because we know that people wrote about destroying documents as to how they treated their slaves, right? Slaves weren't allowed to read or write. And so we have an entire, I guess, historical perspective that is at least written down made by a perspective of people who intentionally didn't allow other people to give their account of history in the same ways that they did. And so it's partly why we are so heavily reliant on oral histories to understand what happened in slavery. But what Hegel looks at here is this idea that because we only understand history from the perspective of slave owners, a more complete grounding of our understanding of the social ills and pros and cons and motivations and treatments of the time would be to include apologies everyone, double apologies, it would be to include perspectives of the slaves, right? And standpoint theory goes on to standpoint theory goes on to agree with him and saying, hey, look, it's not just slaves who weren't looked at properly. Women have had the same treatment, at least that's in a feminist idea of standpoint theory. In a class structural basis of standpoint theory, it would be the peasants, the working class, the proletariat. The proletariat haven't been looked at fairly. We've only had perspectives of men. We've only had the perspectives of rich people, and then we go on to the tried and true and overflogged trope of straight white men. So with that in mind, let's see if there's any points I've made here that I don't have to double over again. I kind of zoomed through it, and then jumping over my big points here. Is there any questions as I quickly double check the notes? Any notes? Let's quickly check. Sorry, okay, 1 second. YouTube. I'm not looking at the YouTube chat right now. I will look at it, but I know there's only like one person over there. So, everyone cool? We are castaways. Uh-oh. Excellent condition stream, but it's frozen. That's hilarious. I don't know what happened there. I guess I clicked on too many things in it and YouTube froze. Alright, so basically, long story short, to just keep drumming on the same damn drum, standpoints are soapboxes within us, I guess, that kind of shout out an idea of perspectives, right? And so, in it being a critical Marxian approach to our social world, or uses at least I think it's even Hegelian more so than Marxist, but I guess Hegelian and Marxist views, what we have to understand is that its adoption by feminist academics and researchers isn't frivolous, right? If the idea here is to look at people who have been underserved previously, it forces us to re-look at the evidence that we've had up until now. And that's a good thing, right? If we have pieces of evidence which appear true, but we then later understand to be incomplete, we probably shouldn't create entire worldviews on incomplete pieces of evidence. I'm willing to argue. I mean, imagine taking someone to trial, arguing for their innocence or guilt, and you don't have all the evidence. That would be a little bit embarrassing, wouldn't it? And it's why evidence gathering is so important in so many aspects, and why we value it so highly, again, in our justice system. The idea that someone can suppress evidence is morally repugnant, because something which may, or something that is, in this case, indicative of truth being found, or the potential for truth to be uncovered or reached, it has been stolen or snatched away from some people, isn't treated lightly. It's a serious conversation that we have. In science, if we don't have access to complete fossil records, for example, we talk about that quite openly. Scientists are quite open about the lapses in their knowledge. When they do have all of the knowledge, or they think they have all of the knowledge available to them, they may create a theory, but if it so turns out that 20 years from now, a piece of evidence comes out which challenges those original theories, they have to revise them. In the social sciences, this idea that we create theories and then we should never really review them is kind of ridiculous. And I guess it's why so many social scientists and theorists are hesitant to kind of create absolutist worldviews, right? And this is where we also end up kind of trickling into and overlapping with postmodernism, right? Because if postmodernists reject this idea that there is like a universal absolute truth, to oversimplify a postmodernist perspective, usually postmodernism is like is in opposition. Let's use a better word, a word I can actually pronounce right now. Is in opposition to something like religion, which would argue that there is a universal truth, moral truth given by God, and therefore everyone and everything should follow it. And the postmodernist says that that's ridiculous. The reason Standpoint stands in opposition to postmodernism is that essentially what is being argued here is that there is a somewhat universal truth to the internalized subjective experiences that each of us go through. And that seems quite ridiculous, right? How can something be subjective and true at the same time? How can something be, how can something matter and be dependent on the analyses and understandings of each and every person, yet at the same time be true for everyone, right? And that's why it falls into this idea of arguing philosophically about how we understand and come to treat knowledge as being true or knowledge in the first place. It's why Standpoint theory and intersubjectivity are relevant to social studies. I'm willing to say that even in it being critical of itself and how we understand and come to argue truth, is useful because, let's face it, I think if we argue to know everything and therefore make a theory to say that we know everything and therefore everything is true, puts us into a bit of a bind, and it will encourage us to discredit and discount new evidence when it does come to light. Now look, don't get me wrong, intersubjectivity does go into a theory. Well, you could probably do 10 entire hours, 10 different episodes of intersubjectivity alone. You know, it goes into ideas of goes into ideas of intersectionality would be the next one on. I'm willing to argue that intersubjectivity is the foundation to intersectionality. Intersubjectivity would go on to be the basis of things like critical anything theory, and the big one at the moment is critical race theory. Intersubjectivity is even a critical analysis of postmodernism in and of itself, of modernism as well, even if it might overlap with the two theories. Standpoint theory is relevant because it forces us to even look at media constructions, right? Something like Noam Chomsky, last week's episode, the idea that we have these massive systems of governance in our media systems which encourage us to take on worldviews that don't serve us. Intersubjectivity and standpoint theory even goes on to serve as a critical foundation for those arguments. And as such, we kind of get in and about the weeds about these sorts of things. And we probably should. We should try and be as specific as possible with our language. We should be at least try to be as accurate as possible with the information and knowledge that we gather. Arguing for or against an absolute truth can be somewhat difficult, especially when we know we can't have access to all truth. So yeah, we talked about the criticisms earlier, didn't we? We talked about how it's biologically determinist. Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, standpoint theory does have some pretty turfy understandings if you look at it first and foremost. I mean, whilst Hartway? Is it Hartway? Oh no, I took out the... Whoops. Uh-oh, 164, here we go. Hartstock, here we go. Yeah, whilst Hartstock, goes on to correct themselves about how standpoint theory should be applied, its original writings are very much rooted in this idea of like biological womanhood, right? Which is a little bit of a difficult one to argue, and even arguably an oxymoron in and of itself, right? Where how can something which is looking at the subjectivity and relatability of all things go on to argue that there is a biological element to its own truth, is a serious, I guess, shortcoming that had to be addressed. So I'm glad Hartstock did that. I think it's arguably for the betterment of the theory, but we do have to be aware that intersubjectivity does go on further from standpoint. Standpoint is something that came out of the late 60s, developed in the 70s, refined in the 80s and 90s. And when this book came out in 2004, the discussion had already moved on. The idea that we can even have black feminism, it comes out from from standpoint theory to argue new perspectives is again another weakness of the theory, that it had to develop and be more inclusive of other voices, which is kind of ironic, right? You go, we have a worldview, a theory that is talking about making our accounts of history more fair and more accurate, and then it completely ignores an entire group of people, right? But that's kind of the nature of, like, I guess, human beings, right? We can only be as truthful to ourselves as our own perspectives, and in so doing, I'm not going to hold it against Heartstock for failing to include every little niche, every little niche perspective of everybody involved. So it is what it is. So I think that's kind of it on standpoint theory for today. I do have some questions though, particularly because of what's been going over the week. And if you follow me on Twitter, which is again at Omarlene, OMARALLEYNE, same as the YouTube channel, and same on everything really. Instagram, Omarlene, Twitter, I'm Omarlene, Vero, I'm Omarlene. Pretty easy to find me. And I've been talking about quite a few things, right? The ideas around. I joked about, someone using how do I say this? That's kind of terms of servicey. Somebody had some very naughty toys that they were keeping under their bed, and I responded that I want them to be in jail, so I'm against prison abolition, right? That's come up. I even referenced it earlier about my tweet about I'm not really vibing with Jack Saint right now because of his garbage. Because of his garbage tweet about Carnival. Actually, let me pull it up. Also, alternatively, if you want to find me on Twitter, you can find me as at ACMOAPod. It's where I mostly post about these streams before they go live. Me and my 44 followers on that account, that tiny account. Let's change the scene actually. Let's put up the tweet first, so we can talk about it and why I'm separating myself from Jack Saint, even though this stream is inspired by him. Here we go. Alright, change the scene, buddy. Let's give OBS 10,000 hours to sort itself out. Actually, I don't even have to show it. Okay, so basically, right, there's a massive conversation going on Twitter, the Twitter discourse about kink at Pride, right? And I will be honest with you, I'm not entirely informed on the conversation. I don't think I have to be. Also, not even the conversation. I'm informed on the conversation. I'm not entirely informed on the discourse, mainly because I'm not going to involve myself in those conversations. They don't really concern me. But there is a conversation as to how much should children be, I guess, exposed to at Pride. And the conversation right now is that we should protect children from kinksters at Pride. And I guess there's kind of an argument to be said there. Now, a lot of people have been basing this on like sexuality grounds, right? That like there are too many sexual objects at Pride. And children, we protect the children. And it's like, okay, if that's really your argument, I mean, so be it. People would be called reactionaries for it. But Jack was kind of like making this argument that he doesn't see it as a necessary negative thing that kinksters are at Pride, and then compared what people consider like deviant filth of kinksters to Carnival, to bikini models, and to cosplay players who basically wear leather. And for some people, I think a lot of people were like, these are non-equivalents. And to a certain extent, I agree with them. But I see Jack's point, right, where like these are somewhat exposing, I guess, parts. Like they are sexualized industries. Whether that is kink, whether that is bikini models in in Sports Illustrated, or like a swimsuit edition, or even like the hot tub meta on Twitch, right? These were women who were being accused of doing softcore because not because they were in the pool, but because they were wearing bikinis to kind of elicit viewers and donations, etc., etc., etc. And then the same thing can be said about cosplayers. Now, the thing that really annoyed me about Carnival was that one, he used a picture that is a little bit long, where the person is covered in body paint. Body paint, I guess body art has long been argued to be non-nude. So kind of comparing it to deliberately sexualized industries that can come along with anime and cosplay and bikinis models and kink in itself. With carnival is a little bit annoying, but also when we consider the history of carnival itself is one that was about liberation from slavery, slavery in itself being an oppressive system which governed every aspect of someone's body once they were under the subjugation of a slave owner, and that therefore this was a celebration not only of liberation of choice and individuality in terms of, you know, people no longer being property, they are actually individuals, human beings worthy of love and and care. um, it then gets a little bit messy when we then see how carnival has been essentially to clamp down on carnival, which is fundamentally an anti-racism event, which argues for the pro-emancipation or emancipatory practices and equality practices of black people, is then used when people then argue its sexual element should be used as a way to shut down carnival. It's a little bit annoying to then make a comparison to, again, these intentionally sexualized industries, right? Because carnival has and is always protected intentionally from being sexualized. This isn't necessarily an extension which is given to bikini wearers or cosplay models. If anything, bikini wearing sexy content is encouraged, especially online, even in traditional print media. To a certain extent, again, it's done in cosplay, even in cartoonized versions of anime. There's a welcomed sexual element to it. Carnival doesn't have that, and so when people then use, I guess, a sexual reading of carnival to delegitimize what carnival stands for and represents, and to then shut down it as an event entirely, whilst people are simultaneously rebuffing the idea that carnival should ever be sexualized because of its harmful implications. And in this case, the harmful implication is that if you shut down an anti-racism event, you then use this kind of like, what about the children? Save the world. Black people don't be viewed here, don't celebrate your own heritage. And sexualization is being used to legitimize these, I guess, ridiculous complaints. It's a little bit painful, if I'm being honest. It does hurt, especially, yes, like I said, people are, and I'm still trying to gather my thoughts, if I'm on it, because it is such a intense reaction. Because again, people shut down when people try and use like carnival for adult entertainment. That is shut down by at a government level. It's shut down on an individual level. Websites get shut down. People attempt to sexualize carnival during carnival season online. They're usually shut down. The only exception that really comes through is in diaspora events. So these be events of people who aren't, I guess I say, born in the Caribbean or in South America, but they have these events in, I guess, more Western settings, for example. Because fundamentally, I'd say carnival in the Caribbean and carnival that happens in the UK are fundamentally two different events that share a heritage and overlap somewhat, but have become so devoid of the original intent that they're fundamentally different experiences. But look, when people are shutting down any sexual readings of it, because the sexual readings go on to perpetuate fetishized ideas around black people, for Jack to misread the event as this, it's also kind of nudie sexual, like kink and cosplay and bikini is. I'm just like, you kind of lost me, Jack, if I'm being honest. Because I know he's the kind of person that argues that sexuality being read at an event isn't bad, or sexuality being read at a thing isn't inherently a bad thing, which, okay, that is what it is. But we can also argue at the same time that deliberately sexualizing or misreading into sexualized readings of things and people can lead to negative outcomes for people. is also a bad thing, right? Like, we don't sexualize children because in sexualizing children we encourage child abuse to happen. In this case, sexualizing carnival goes on to perpetuate stereotypes and essentially racism against black people through long-standing tropes of, black people like these, sex goddesses or whatever. And that's been a thing that's come up in the Harlem Renaissance, that they had to challenge as individuals. It's something that's come up in slumming it, when rich white people would go down to like the ghettos where black people lived to essentially have sex with black people, and then go back home to the suburbs and write about it. It's a thing that's come up even today in like online dating culture, where they, have you ever been with a oh, I've never been with a black woman before, I've never been with a black guy. Or this thing of like, oh yeah, black people, if I'm white and I sleep with a black person, I'll have like pretty babies or whatever. Like, they are negative things, because then these children go on to live in worlds where people don't really want them around. They like get called horrible things. But anyway, that's procreation anyway, slightly different. So yeah, I see Jack's point, but yeah, the sexualization of carnival is actively discouraged. So to use it to intentionally misread carnival to make a point that is like approximated to sexuality is kind of hurtful. Kind of disappointed in him. But anyway, any other questions? Oh yeah, I didn't answer actually. I didn't answer the abolitionist thing. Yeah. Yeah, he was kind of a weird guy. Yeah, if you have a load of naughty adult toys under your bed and you're showing off them on Twitter, yeah, you should go to jail. I'm willing to abolish a prison abolitionist perspective if that guy goes to jail. Go to horny jail. I mean, fundamentally, yeah, look, don't get me wrong. I mean, when people talk about abolish the police, they are and abolish prisons, they are controversial opinions for a reason, or controversial perspectives for a reason. The only difference is that this isn't an opinion like that isn't grounded in some academic reality, right? And this is an academic platform, it's an academic stream. If I'm reading a material to say, hey, look, we can have a world where people who are deserving of jail, essentially, which is a separation from society, should be rehabilitated. That shouldn't be a controversial opinion, right? If someone is saying that the funds that are going towards fundamentally tired police forces should be, reinvested to serve specialists in, say, mental health care, I don't see it as a controversial opinion. I mean, if we have police officers who are overworked because they're doing way too much paperwork, and who are overworked because they have to do 10,000 different things to call outs that they are fundamentally undertrained for, because there just isn't enough time to train them properly, why shouldn't money be given to smaller, specialist people who then go on to deal with it, right? So like, if I see like a noise complaint, right, do the police need to attend a noise complaint in the same way that they need to approach a mental health incident on the high road? I would argue no, right? One is intentionally to keep the peace. That's a noise complaint in my respect. That has different economic value. That's why I brought economic value. I don't know why I've been hooked on economics for recently. Whereas a mental health one is fundamentally a healthcare issue, right? So surely if we have healthcare staff, like ambulance crews, or even a specialist mental health unit at each hospital who is able to then deal with mental health crises that happens in public or even in private, if it happens in your own home and you need help, and I'm calling for help, I don't need a police officer to turn up. I need someone who's a mental health professional to turn up and help me out, right? Why shouldn't resources be reallocated to help to get people where they need it, right? And so when we talk about prisons, it's another thing. I know people talk about statistics about, most people in prison are serving non-violent drug offences. And I don't know how true that is, if I'm honest. I haven't found data to really back that up. It might just be hyperbole or rhetoric to kind of get people on board. But when we're talking about like people sending people to jail and they come out and reoffend, they haven't been rehabilitated. It was a waste of everyone's time. It's like £80,000 a year in the UK or £50,000 a year in the UK to house a someone in prison, that's twice the median income, right? It's ridiculous. That is a ridiculous amount of money we're spending on essentially wasting everyone's time. If we had, again, a mental if people go somewhere and they're rehabilitated, if the reason they commit crime is mostly socioeconomic, where people are creating illicit and illegal ways to generate income, and they go to jail, they come out of jail and they still don't have their social conditions met because they can't get a job, and or they just don't have the skills to do it. They're gonna do the same thing before, because fundamentally we need money to survive, right? I'm not gonna hold that against someone. It's just kind of ridiculous on our end that we didn't give them the skills or the opportunity to not reoffend again. So we just end up spending more and more money on these people. Don't get me wrong, there are people who potentially are unrehabilitatable, right? And in that case, I would say I see that as a mental health issue again. If we have someone who is committing, I'm going to use the word murders, right? If someone's committing murders, and they fundamentally do not value human life, that is an issue that we as a society have to deal with, right? That is someone who is a threat to any and everyone who else is a human being, right? And we have to be serious about it. Like we treat arson as a mental health issue, and that is essentially just destruction of property. Why? Because it then leads to the potential to harm human beings. We treat shoplifting, kleptomania as a mental health condition. Again, these sorts of things are mental health conditions, and so if we have adequate funding for mental health practitioners, institutions, events, places, destigmatize mental health issues in our society, do we need prisons would be my question. I know people talk about exile. I think that's kind of a dumb idea. Like, we don't have Siberia, for crying out loud. And last time the UK sent people to exile, we ended up with Australia, right? We don't need those sorts of places. We may need something that is essentially doing the same function as a prison, but the intention is to at least try to rehabilitate these people, whether that is through medication, whether that is through simply just keeping them away from society, but it's a productive way in which that time is being used, right? Because I don't see a benefit in putting someone down, especially when restorative justice. Funnily enough, if I didn't watch How to Get Away with Murder, I might not have brought this point up. But yeah, especially when we understand that restorative justice works, where that is where you have the perpetrator of a crime talk to the victims' families, and the victim's family essentially says, "This is how you hurt us," and the court may say, "You know what? You can either go off scot-free or you serve 1,000,000 years in jail, and you pay £1 million in damages," right? I find that if we then have someone who is not rehabilitatable, if that's a real phrase, but we do see them as potentially having economic value, but they can't be in society, I see them as being, if we can keep them out of our society, but we attempt to rehabilitate them, and they are working at the same time, whether that is through prison factories. Let's face it, if prison factories are garbage, but most of the time we argue that they're garbage because the prisoners aren't paid properly, right? So if we pay them an adequate amount and a proportionate amount goes to the victims' families, I see a way that benefits our economy, the people who the person hurt, and they can essentially be paying for the reason why they're in jail. And I know this is a very problematic extension of ideas, but why can't we have prison call centers, right? I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of con men who are in jail right now who... Oh, wait, that's a bad idea, actually. It's a bad idea. But basically, they have the skills. And if we were rehabilitating them and we think that they're kind of safe to interact with society in some way, maybe we have a prison call center. If they have to work in a factory, making carpentry, that then gets used for tables and chairs, that then supports a small local business, that they then resell and upsell to the rest of us normies, I don't see it as a bad thing, and a portion of those of that money goes towards the victims' families. I don't see it as a bad thing, essentially, if we can create an entire economy where victims' families don't ever have to work another day in their lives, that's not necessarily a bad thing, is it? I would support that idea of passive income. I probably have to. Don't get me wrong. That is just me, spitballing on a live stream on YouTube. That isn't me looking at academic material there. But fundamentally, the belief is still sound that there is a way to rehabilitate people. People who aren't rehabilitated usually, what I am going to argue, have a mental health issue that needs to be treated. These things are already mental health issues. That is, are already treated with people outside of society because they either pose a threat to themselves or others. These aren't controversial. Like psych wards aren't controversial. The treatment of people in psych wards are. I think we probably stop making moral judgments about things because of how we use them more so than what they are. Hey, look, that's epistemology again. Hey, yay, relevant to the stream. But anyway, we've had half an hour of extra nonsense to make up the hour and a half time. If you have any questions though, send them in. I'll probably do questions at the beginning of next week if you have any. Thanks as always for tuning in, and enjoy the rest of your day, even though it's now pouring down with rain. I hope you didn't have plans to go anywhere. I had to put on the ring light just so you see ring light, just so you can see me. That's how dark it's got. So anyway, take care, people. See you later.